Well, joining us now for more on the Tamarack mine is Paula Maccabee. She is the Advocacy Director and Counsel for WaterLegacy here in Minnesota. Paula, always a pleasure to have you on WTIP.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning.
We've been hearing from the White House about this, the release that came out on February 22nd, mentioning specifically Talon Metals and the Tamarack mine, the Biden administration then also invoking the Defense Production Act in order to increase mining of these minerals to power electric vehicles. There's a lot of news around this across the country. This is now certainly beyond just the scope of northern Minnesota or Minnesota. And when we talk to officials with the Tamarack mine, they talk a lot about electric vehicles. It's kind of become the driving rhetoric behind this project. You've expressed some concerns about this specific project as well. Paula, what do you view as some areas of concern before this project even starts to submit the mining plan and so forth?
Well, thank you, Joe. I think the first area of concern is the whole premise behind the Defense Production Act. And what this is really about is $300 billion in infrastructure improvements needed to reduce climate change that are being held hostage by a couple senators bought and paid for by the mining industry. And it looks like there is a deal forming that if the United States is going to get any help in moving towards alternative energy, then the communities, and they're often tribal communities, next to mineral resources are going to take a big hit. And that's just plain wrong. And I think about climate change, it's almost like metabolic disease. It's like we've had too much consumption and the wrong kind of consumption. Maybe I go to the doctor and I say, I am overweight and I got high blood pressure. And the doctor says, eat more vegetables. And that doctor is not saying, stop the supersizing of the French fries and the high sugar sodas. He's just saying, eat more vegetables. Well, that's not going to cure metabolic disease, and it's not going to cure climate change. We can't keep doing the unhealthy and ecologically destructive extreme mining and then add some electric vehicles on top. We actually need to look at a more systemic change. And so I think that the policy itself takes mining as the first resort when it should be the last resort after all options that are less toxic, involve recycling and reuse and less energy to consume are run out. And we're nowhere near that. We're starting with let's keep all the unhealthy practices and then maybe add a little kale on top.
Well, Paula, we hear a lot about recycling of these metals and so forth when we've heard from people concerned about twin metals and when we spoke with you about Polymit and other projects and so forth. What does that look like in Minnesota or across the country? We say that term and just move on. What do you know some specifics of how that could be done?
Well, there are beginning to be companies that are making contracts for recycled scrap metals, as well as trying to make contracts for the sourcing of metals from mining. And what would a policy that put recycling first say? It would first talk about how do we produce, whether it's our computers or our cell phones, are they being produced so that they can be easily recycled? And are we requiring the producers of our technology to take back and actually recycle them rather than stick them in some foreign landfill? And we would have a set of incentives that instead of incentivizing mining and ecological destruction, incentivize long-term use, reuse, and recycling. And that is a public policy that we've talked about. I remember talking about it in 1980, and basically nothing has been done either on a state level or on a federal level to say that our priority is not to put money in the hands of a few multinational mining companies, but to put money in the hands of small, local recyclers, and to make sure that both at the industry level and at the private consumer level, we're not wasting. I mean, that's what recycling and reuse is. It's just don't waste stuff. We've already gotten so many toxic metals out of the ground. We've caused a lot of harm to do that. Let's not waste that. Let's reuse it. And the level of policy to implement that really critical step simply is not there.
Well, so let's talk specifics about the Talon project, the Tamarack mine. When they mention words like rich nickel deposit, there's a lot of profit involved in something like that, but it's also extremely intense. That's when you use that phrase before, Paula, massive sulfide mineralization. Can you expand on that?
Yes, actually the term massive sulfide mineralization is the term that Talon Metals uses to describe their nickel deposits. And that's as compared to polymet or twin metals that call their sulfide ores disseminated. And what massive sulfide mineralization means is that there's a much higher concentration of nickel and cobalt, which are themselves very toxic metals, and also much higher levels of sulfide. So that whether that material after mining is stored underground or whether it's stored above ground, there is a high, almost insuperable problem of acid mine drainage. And so when we're talking about high grade or class 1 nickel, what we're talking about is extremely toxic material, toxic to wild rice, to human beings, to aquatic life, to wildlife, basically to the entire ecological system of animals, plants, and human beings.
So there are some concerns from the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe and from our listeners in WTIP. When we think about twin metals, we think about the boundary waters for location and Polymet Lake Superior and so forth. But for this project, it's maybe just a little bit out of that purview specific for WTIP. But anytime somebody drives to the cities, they're going to cross over the Kettle River, they're going to connect with the Mississippi when they get down toward the metro and so forth. So this is the watershed of concern for people like the Tamarack Water Alliance community and WaterLegacy and so forth. What are you hearing from Mille Lacs Band members about their concerns and where that fits in with treaty rights and just water and issues like that?
Well, I think, Joe, that at the scale of the Tamarack mine, or the Talon Metals mine, as it's now being called, there would be a huge number of impacts on both water quality and water quantity. If they're talking about underground mining, the dewatering would affect wetlands that are used as resources by the treaty resources by the Fond du Lac Band and the Mille Lacs Band. And the Talon Metals has control over 30,000 acres of surface land. And if any of us have, I've been to New York to visit, that's twice the size of Manhattan. And although they're now targeting their prospecting in a narrow area, their documents are absolutely clear that they are intending to expand their resource through the full range of that intrusion of metals, and that everywhere they have drilled so far, they have found high concentrations of nickel and cobalt and copper. So I think that people need to look at this not just as a mine that's going to affect a very small area and a small community, but a mine that has the potential to affect water quality and water quantity in the recreational lakes around Aitkin County, in the wild rice lakes, the resources for the Fond du Lac Band and the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, but also affect the Kettle River, the St. Croix River, the Tamarack River, all of which flow into the Mississippi River. And if the Mississippi River is affected with increased sulfates, that means increased mercury contamination of fish for really large population centers and many people up and down these important recreational areas and important communities who will be experiencing some of the problems. So I think we need to look at this single mine with its potential 30,000 acres of impact and massive sulfide mineralization has the potential to threaten the ecology of a very vast area of water resources. And there's a huge propaganda pressure that this is the right thing to do, a lot of greenwashing, and basically none of the impacts on any of the surface or groundwater resources have even been studied or disclosed. So there are a lot of people jumping the gun without having the science or the information to back up the plans for that mine.
Well, when we hear from the governor, really, Governor Tim Walz sends out a statement about it. He says, we'll let the state agencies make the determinations. We'll let science figure out if this is the right fit and so forth. We hear the same type of sentiments from Rob Eklund when he comes on WTIP. you and I have had a discussion previously about the state agencies, the DNR, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and so forth, that system in and of itself is broken in a sense. And do you see that is still a situation that would be equitable here?
Joe, I think you make some really good points. WaterLegacy has studied the permitting system for mines in Minnesota. And basically what the Department of Natural Resources does when it issues a mine permit is a blank check. They issue a blank check. So there's no mine permit which says you can only mine for so many years, or you can only mine this much mineral resources, and after that you have to stop. And we've also learned that the courts don't provide a backstop. In the case of the Polymet mine, Polymet's put out information to its investors that it planned to expand. And when the advocates went to the courts said, no, Polymet doesn't have to do an environmental impact statement considering its potential expansion. And on the other hand, when North Shore Mine, they had initially an environmental impact statement for a small mine, and the environmental groups asked, hey, now that they're planning to expand into some higher sulfide areas, we want more environmental review. The court said no to that as well. So we have a track record where once a mine gets a permit, they can expand, they can mine for a longer period, they can go into more toxic areas. They can even if they got an initial permit for an underground mine, those mines in Minnesota history have expanded into open pit mines as well. So the idea that we can trust our agencies to make sure that the Talon mine would be limited, or that the community would be protected, or nature would be protected, there's absolutely no history that supports that point of view, and decades of history showing that Minnesota agencies will let the mining companies do whatever they want to, will procrastinate on enforcement, and then when the mine goes bankrupt or defaults or finishes at the end, the pollution is left for the entire community or the taxpayers to bear the burden.
We've heard some impassioned speeches and rhetoric from Senator Tom Bach recently about just the history of mining in Minnesota, the clean water that still exists here in the northern part of the state, and that there's this legacy of mining in Minnesota. And when these conversations come up, that you start to hear more about the history of mining in Minnesota and that there's these new roadblocks. So, Paula, I'm wondering, just if somebody was to come up to you and say, you're just anti-mining, that's the bottom line here, you're just against mining, what would you say to them?
I'd say two things. First of all, the traditional iron mining and taconite mining is not completely without problems. But the level of toxicity, the level of sulfate and toxic metals that would be involved with massive sulfide mineralization, nickel mining, they're just not comparable. And I'm saying even with iron mining, which I think has a very different cost-benefit ratio, and certainly did at the time of the Second World War when there were very important needs for iron, which is a relatively non-toxic metal. That cost-benefit analysis is very different when looking at a more toxic form of mining. And Minnesota has had problems even controlling the pollution from taconite mining. If we had a history where I could say, gee, we've figured out how to do the much less toxic mining, let's try this. But that's the opposite of the case. Minnesota agencies have shown that even with a much, much less dangerous kind of mining, they're just not up to the task.
All right. Well, we'll wait and see. Still in the early stages of where this mine could potentially go as far as its extraction, its size. There's a lot of unknowns, but also at the same time, a lot of attention now in April in 2022. Appreciate your thoughts on this. We're speaking today with Paula Maccabee, the Advocacy Director and Counsel for WaterLegacy. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Joe.